We actually have to thank the listeners for this sort of two-part series. I have an article up on the site looking at the next Kupp and looking at the next Debo. We had a question from Christopher Reyes asking who those guys were going to be this season. It helped me, right, to think through this even more directly. I've got so many players that I have priority targets on, and listeners can get those by going to my redraft rankings, which are always pretty aggressive, right? They're not trying to follow consensus that closely. I have the guys that I'm targeting up high enough that you'll be able to tell who they are. I have the guys that I'm not drafting low enough that you won't accidentally hit them if they drop a few spots. Again, you want to make sure that you tailor those to your own specific draft and purposes if you're using them directly in drafts. But so the players that we're looking to target, I think, are pretty clear cut. But sometimes you'll go in and you'll try and figure out, well, exactly why did Cooper Kupp appear to come out of nowhere? And he had been a very solid NFL player and fantasy wide receiver, but how does he come from an ADP in the late 40s and put up one of the greatest wide receiver seasons of all time? How does Deebo Samuel come from an ADP even much, much later than that and average 21 fantasy points per game? In both cases, there are some specific contextual reasons that do help us understand what happened there a little bit. You look at some of those, you dive into it, and it can be a real trap to say, okay, this is what happened with a specific player last year. We've got a guy in a similar situation. He's going to follow that exact same thesis, benefit in the exact same ways. And yet it can be helpful to know when perhaps there are some value elements to where a player could outperform a teammate, could outperform draft position. We don't think it will be to nearly the same extent that Cooper Kupp did it last year. But Colm, start us out by looking at a few of these elements that did camouflage or at least create a dynamic to where Kupp could come from where he was in 2019, 2020. We talked on the previous show about Robert Woods and how he had a better target share than Kupp as teammates over those two seasons. How did Kupp get from where he was to suddenly being one of the greatest wide receivers of all time?
Well, I guess something we could slot in as well is that Robert Woods did get injured. It's not something that we is discussed fully in it, but that probably helped propel him. But that isn't the exact reason that the leap happened. You mentioned two players in this that the leap has happened to over the last two seasons to try and find how we could find the options for this year. One of those, Stephon Diggs, obviously went from Kirk Cousins to Josh Allen. It wasn't just that he went to Buffalo, though, in that situation. In terms of how he was used by the Bills in that offense, a wide variety of routes that he had, been able to implement into his game and became kind of an all-round playmaker in that season. He was kind of going in the 6th, 7th round, and he made that jump. Cooper Kupp, though, didn't just go from Jared Goff to Matthew Stafford. Obviously, Stafford came from the Lions, but his snap share in that situation jumped from 80% to 94%. So in terms of the routes that he added 108 routes all the way up to 576 routes on the season. So obviously then there was an increased volume that also came with that. And when we look through Kupp's career, we're probably not projecting that was going to happen at this particular time. But changing offenses and changing to a much better quarterback are two things that have happened over those last couple of seasons. You look, Shawn, then at who is in that situation in 2022. We have Devontae Adams going from the Packers to the Raiders. I would say quarterback situation is probably not going to improve there, but obviously the way he maybe worked may change. But in terms of Adams, all the routes in the world, he has been running them for multiple seasons. Tyreek Hill, he is obviously going to the Dolphins to being his quarterback. May present challenges, but he also may be used slightly different in this offense. AJ Brown is an interesting one because he could have an increased, use in terms of the targets that he sees. Allen Robinson would be going over to partner with Cooper Kupp. We have Marquise Brown then traded to the Cardinals and Juju Smith-Schuster, who is an interesting option, who is now with Patrick Mahomes. So out of that list, I'm probably leaning towards AJ Brown or Juju Smith-Schuster, but obviously AJ Brown going much, much higher in drafts. Juju Smith-Schuster, very, very interesting. But Shawn, the ones that really fit the mold are the Denver Broncos pass catchers in Cortland Sutton and Jerry Judy. Interesting you didn't go all the way in and add KJ Hamler to the list as the next Cooper Kupp here, but they will now be catching passes from Russell Wilson. How are you feeling as you broke this down and the opportunity for them to actually step in? And it is very, very similar to last year because Robert Woods and Kupp were going so close in ADP as well at that particular time.
Yeah, you have this real boost from Matthew Stafford, and it's not just for Cooper Kupp. You go back in and look at some of his recent targets, and Kenny Golladay averaging over 10.4 adjusted yards per attempt when targeted by Stafford. Kupp at 9.9, Marvin Jones 9.3. No surprise, obviously, that Golladay and Jones are not the same players now that they're not catching passes from Stafford. We contrast that with Russell Wilson, who had this rapport with Tyler Lockett, where Lockett, when he was the target, they combined for a 10.7 AYA there. DK Metcalf also up over 9.3. Other peripheral types of targets also up over 9.5 for Russell Wilson. One of the things I kind of throw into the article just as an aside is that we do have a receiver who's played with both of these quarterbacks. Golden Tate, 10.4 AYA, catching passes from Wilson, only 7.8 from Matthew Stafford. Now, there's some context there. He was a high target depth player in Seattle, over 11 air yards per target. That dropped dramatically for the Lions, who used him at an 8 out of just 7. The flip side of that, and one of the reasons why the Lions paid him but then used him that way, is that he had a lot more targets with the Lions. And one thing that we want to mention from time to time is just having a deeper depth of target isn't always good. Sometimes it means that that depth is coming because the receiver is not being used underneath. You think about someone like a Stephon Diggs, for example, you want the target depth to be representative of all different types of targets, not just deep targets. So you always want to make sure you keep those things in context. But I did think it was, probably just completely misleading, but sort of fun to show the contrast there between Wilson and Stafford with Golden Tate. But the real question that we get here is, what are some of the similarities between Woods and Kupp that we might then be able to see with this Broncos team? And the thing that we saw, and this is something that Ben had pointed out to his Stealing Signal subscribers last season at this time, was that even though Woods was getting more routes per game and as a result then had a greater target share, Kupp was a little bit more effective at actually drawing targets per route, and that led him to be a little bit more effective in terms of yards per route. We pull up the Stealing Signals tool. We look at the Denver Broncos from last season. We see that, there's a difference here in terms of routes and route percentage, in part because Jerry Judy was fairly significantly injured at the beginning of the year. He comes back and then doesn't play a full complement, doesn't run a full complement of routes, but his target per route percentage, 22%, trumped Cortland Sutton at 19%. He also was more effective in terms of yards per target. Again, the element that we mentioned in the previous show, where you really want both of those things up there at 8.3, especially when you consider just how bad the quarterback play was last year. Those aren't bad numbers, right? He ends up just under 2 yards per route in the Sports Info Solutions charting data. You think about these guys and the situation here with Russell Wilson, and it just feels like the sky is the limit, right? Especially because we know that Wilson is a deep pass savant in many ways. Jerry Judy, one of the top air yards players in his rookie season of 2020. Cortland Sutton, one of the top air yards guys in 2021. You think about how that played out and why these players are not more expensive even than they are. And you're not going to get either of these guys for free, but especially when you compare ADPs, there's actually a pretty close similarity between Sutton and Judy this year compared to where Woods and Kupp were a year ago. But among receivers with at least 1,500 air yards in 2020, Judy ranked dead last in air conversion. Among the receivers with at least 1,500 air yards in 2021, Sutton ranked dead last. Russell Wilson is here, Colm. These guys are priced to reflect that, but there's still upside where they're going.
No, I think there's huge upside. My question here is, if we have listeners who are only drafting one roster, both are available, who should they pick?
Well, let me throw that one back to you. I've made the case here for Jerry Judy. Zachary Kruger and I are currently drafting an FFPC Best Ball Tournament team. We had the 111, which means that when the draft came back to us at 311, Courtland Sutton was the top player on our board. He had fallen a few slots below ADP, which you like to see. If you're going to get some Sutton exposure, that's how I like to do it. You mentioned the one team, and if you're just drafting one team, it is an interesting question, right? Because I think that, when we're drafting...
And it doesn't have to be one, but like we're drafting, like it's easy for us to say, like I said in the last show, I'm drafting Robert Woods and Treylon Burks. Like we can do that over and over again and get as many of them as we want. But if you're not drafting in high volume, it can be a challenge, and sometimes for people it can be a huge decision as to which one to get. Because if you were drafting last year and you have 5 leagues and 4 of those you go with Robert Woods and you skip on Cooper Kupp and all of them, it leaves you probably little bit salty at the end of the season.
It probably does. It probably does. The reason it's an interesting question is that we do get so used to taking the guy who's a value for that draft slot.
Yeah.
And not necessarily thinking, well, do I want to reach all the way for the number 2 guy? The other part that I go into here in the article a little bit is that Courtland Sutton has been getting the rave reviews from camp. We discussed in the last show that I think you want to be a little bit careful about just being a news-based drafter, right? You'll get yourself a little bit off of all of the plays that you had intended to make based on a full offseason's worth of research, based on what happened last year, and based on sort of the bigger picture in some contexts. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to layer in some quotes here from teammates, from Russell Wilson, from Melvin Gordon, from his head coach, talking about, again, the fantastic route running. And that's been something that the beat writers are also mentioning, is that, Jerry Judy is this crazy route runner. He gets open so easily, but maybe that doesn't really fit with Russell Wilson's strengths. And I think anybody who's watched the Seahawks over the years is thinking the same thing. It's like, he just drops back and waits. It's not like he hits those guys when they come open. Like he's going to hit him 40, 50 yards down the field. That's how the offense either works or doesn't work. But we're talking about this combination of wide receiver talent and skill that makes them sort of who they are. To discount an elite skill from a player is kind of a weird way to go about it, right? And especially if that is still very clearly manifesting itself in practices that are being observed currently. The other thing here, just as we kind of compile the circumstantial evidence, is, you've got a guy who was the number 15 overall pick in the 2020 draft. A year later, Devontae Smith and Jalen Waddle were top 10 picks. They go on to each gain over 900 receiving yards. This doesn't mean that Judy is better than those guys. And at this point, I would say, he's probably not better than they are. And yet he's younger than them. Even though he's been in the NFL for an extra season, he also got to the big breakout in college much sooner than they did. In 2018, those guys are on the same team, and Judy gains almost twice as many yards as they do combined. He more than doubles their receiving touchdowns. The main takeaway here for all 3 of these guys is that probably the floor and ceiling for all 3 of them is pretty good. And so you do want to have some exposure. And then that brings you back to, well, what if it's just one draft? Which guy would you prefer to have? Courtland Sutton is an established NFL player who had a big-time season before he had the serious injury, before they had the terrible quarterback play. You get someone like that who has the size and physicality as well that Judy doesn't. You get him with Russell Wilson, and you get him at a price that, it's expensive, but you can still justify that price. It's not like he's going where Mike Williams and Michael Pittman are going. So, I mean, you can afford to draft him. I think that you probably still want to have him, but I think it's closer than the ADP gap suggests. I mean, he's going at the end of the third in a lot of drafts right now. So that really is the same basic price as Mike Williams. Jerry Judy, it doesn't seem to be any of the drafts that I personally am doing, but in a lot of drafts, he has an ADP early in the fifth. That's a big discount in terms of how you're putting your team together. And so if you have a pick early in the third and you're thinking to yourself, maybe I actually want to draft Courtland Sutton here, because that's probably where he should go, right? He should be going ahead of these guys in the third round. You might still wait and just say, I think that Judy is going to come back to me in the fourth. If I had somebody else in the fourth, I might even be able to, be gutsy with it and let him slide into the early fifth. That's where he should be, even though if you've got Jerry Judy as a third round value, it's going to be hard to pass on him in the fourth and hope he gets back to you in the fifth, because you're going to be heartbroken if he doesn't make it there. I mean, Rashad Bateman is the guy that I have as a priority target, and he goes above ADP in every draft that I'm in. Colm,
every draft.
Yeah, I mean, you're like, there have to be some drafts out there where Rashad Bateman is really inexpensive, or else his ADP would not be where it shows up in the tools. So those are some of the dynamics that you're dealing with. But even as a huge Kansas City Chiefs fan, and perhaps as a Kansas City Chiefs fan who is very excited about the fireworks that we're going to get with the Raiders, the fireworks we're going to get with the Chargers, the fireworks that we're going to get in this just incredibly exciting season in 2022 that's coming up here, those fireworks with the Broncos, I think you have to have exposure to these guys. Russell Wilson in Denver should be a very fun team.
Yeah, no, I agree with all that. The one part there, so I just want to pin you down on this. You're leaning towards Jerry Judy.
Well, I had Jerry Judy as a late second round pick in the 2023 draft projection that Ben and I did for Stealing Bananas. So if listeners want to go find out if Courtland Sutton was in there and want to find out if Courtland Sutton or Jerry Judy was in Ben's second round for 2023, that episode is out, and it was a lot of fun to record.
Yeah, no, well, I'm going to say I'll jump. I love Jerry Judy, but Courtland Sutton's I've always leaned to the Courtland Sutton side of these two guys. But a couple of things there that that it's amazing that Jerry Judy has just turned 23 years old. So when we're looking at players ascending, a big season by Jerry Judy does put him into that round two range where he's ascending upwards. When we get to the end of this season, we're going to be looking at a situation where Courtland Sutton will turn 27 during the season in October, so he's going to be into that more veteran side of his career. So Jerry Judy is definitely the one in terms of next season that we could see that massive jump from. I just think a couple of things you mentioned in terms of the body size and that, it almost reminds me a little bit of Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf. And if I was drafting those, I would be targeting DK Metcalf out of the two. You mentioned a very good point in terms of how Russell Wilson tends to target his players. He obviously can, he can throw slants, he can throw shorter passes. If a player has a good route, he's obviously able to do the time and stuff too. But you do see a lot of it where he is shuffling around and it's a deep pass downfield. And I think that Sutton, and I also think obviously we'll throw Hamler in the mix, but I think Jerry Judy can also do that. If you need Jerry Judy to just run past somebody down the sideline, I think he can definitely do it. So I'm excited about both of these guys. So just to have a little bit of a differentiation, I'll say Courtland Sutton, but it is harder to draft Sutton where he's going based on ADP. There is a lot of players going in that range that I do like, but let's say I'll go with Keenan Allen. If it's Keenan Allen versus Courtland Sutton at that spot, and everyone else that I like's gone, I would take Courtland Sutton over him. So I have no problem if those other options are out of town at that point of the draft, going with Courtland Sutton. So we'll check that, Shawn, as it goes throughout the season. I'm hoping both of the guys just absolutely smash. I mentioned the comparison with Lockett and Metcalf. Those guys have feasted with Russell Wilson. So let's hope that is the same situation here. And who knows, even in Denver, the air is a bit, I don't know if it's lighter or thinner or what. There's obviously something that's mile high, but let's hope that means that Russell Wilson can even air these balls out further, and that just leads to more points for us. But Shawn, it is going to be fun to see if one of those guys does turn into that role this year. It feels like Jerry Judy, certainly with the ADP that we talked about, is more fitting that mold. Anything that you want to add in to wrap up, or have we covered it all there?
No, I like your wrap. It's interesting to think about DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett now without Wilson, and we have been taking some Metcalf because he falls pretty deep into some of these drafts. Still does obviously offer that size, athleticism profile that's almost unparalleled. So ways to play both sides of this, and we can't let it go without also saying make sure you're drafting KJ Hamler.